May 1905. The telegraph wires across Europe and America suddenly erupt with impossible news. An entire imperial armada, the pride of the largest continuous land empire on Earth, has just been annihilated in a matter of hours. Out of nearly 40 warships sent halfway across the globe, only 3 shattered vessels have survived. The rest are at the bottom of the sea, taking thousands of sailors with them. For the first time in modern history, a massive white European superpower has been completely and humiliatingly crushed by an Asian island nation. In the lavish halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, a man sits holding the telegram that confirms this apocalyptic disaster. He is Tsar Nicholas II, the absolute, unquestioned ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface. He commands an army of millions. He believes with every fiber of his being that he was appointed by God himself. How did this happen? How did a man with virtually unlimited resources, ruling over a population of 130 million people, allow his empire to be dragged into one of the most lopsided massacres in naval history? The answer does not lie in a lack of guns, or a shortage of men, or a failure of logistics. The answer lies in the mind of the emperor himself. It lies in a fatal, blinding arrogance. Nicholas II did not view the Japanese as a legitimate military threat. To the Tsar and his aristocratic generals, the enemy was simply an inferior race, a tiny island people who would surely run in terror at the mere sight of a Russian imperial uniform. It was a deeply rooted imperial prejudice, born not just from arrogance, but from a dark personal grudge, a secret written in blood on a torn shirt, locked away in a St. Petersburg museum. We often think the Romanov dynasty fell in the freezing winter of 1917, but the truth is, the first domino was pushed 12 years earlier. By blindly underestimating his enemy, Nicholas II triggered a deadly chain reaction. This single arrogant mistake ignited the bloody revolution of 1905, shattered the myth of the Tsar's divine power, and paved a direct, unavoidable path straight to the basement of the Ipatiev house. This is not just the story of a lost war. This is the story of the Tsar's first and most fatal mistake. Let us begin.
To understand how an empire commits suicide, we must look not at the battlefields, but at a sunny spring afternoon in the Japanese town of Otsu. The year was 1891, 13 years before the war began. Nicholas II was not yet the Tsar. He was a 22-year-old Tsarevich, a sheltered heir to the Russian throne, embarking on a grand tour of the East. Japan was supposed to be a pleasant diplomatic stopover, but on May 11th, as his rickshaw moved through the narrow, crowded streets of Otsu, a local Japanese escort policeman suddenly broke rank. Without a word, the man drew a razor-sharp samurai sword and lunged at the future emperor. The blade struck Nicholas on the right side of his head, slicing through his scalp down to the bone. As the assassin raised his katana for a second lethal strike, Nicholas's cousin, Prince George of Greece, managed to parry the blow with his bamboo cane, while the rickshaw drivers wrestled the attacker to the ground. Nicholas survived. He was rushed to medical care, his face and white shirt drenched in his own blood. That blood-stained shirt is still preserved today in the archives of the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, a dark physical relic of a day that changed the course of world history. The physical scar on the Tsar's skull eventually healed, but the psychological trauma never did. Nicholas returned to Russia with a visceral, burning hatred for Japan and its people. He viewed the assassination attempt not as the act of a lone madman, but as proof of the treacherous, uncivilized nature of the entire Japanese nation. From that day forward,
the future ruler of Russia suffered from a fatal blind spot. In his personal diaries and private correspondence, the Tsar routinely referred to the Japanese using deeply derogatory, racist terms, most notably calling them macaques or monkeys. When Nicholas ascended to the throne 3 years later in 1894, he brought this toxic prejudice into the halls of supreme power. And this prejudice blinded him to a terrifying reality. Japan was no longer the medieval sword-wielding nation he remembered. While the Russian imperial court danced in the opulent ballrooms of the Winter Palace, the Japanese Empire was undergoing a miracle of modernization known as the Meiji Restoration. In a matter of decades, they had transformed from an isolated feudal society into a hyper-industrialized powerhouse. They were studying Western tactics. They were building a massive, highly disciplined army. And most importantly, they were ordering state-of-the-art, heavily armored battleships from the finest shipyards in Great Britain. Japan was rapidly becoming an apex predator in the Pacific. But from his throne in St. Petersburg, thousands of miles away, Nicholas saw none of this. He looked at the map of the world and saw only the divine destiny of the Russian Empire. Driven by an obsession with expanding his territory to the ice-free ports of the Pacific Ocean, Nicholas pushed his military machine relentlessly eastward. He ordered the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, a massive ribbon of steel cutting through the frozen wasteland of Asia, designed to project Russian power all the way to the coast of China. In 1898, Russia aggressively leased the strategic naval base of Port Arthur on the Yellow Sea, placing a heavy Russian boot directly on Japan's doorstep. The Japanese government, deeply alarmed by this massive Russian expansion into their sphere of influence, attempted to negotiate. They offered a pragmatic compromise. Japan would recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria if Russia would recognize Japanese dominance in Korea. It was a fair diplomatic solution that could have averted a global catastrophe. But Tsar Nicholas II, surrounded by a tight circle of sycophants and opportunistic aristocrats, refused to even entertain the idea of compromising with a nation he considered inferior. His advisors, men who stood to make millions in personal fortunes from Korean timber concessions, whispered exactly what the Tsar wanted to hear. They assured him that the Japanese were bluffing. They told him that the yellow monkeys would never dare to attack the great white Christian empire of Russia. When Japanese diplomats sent urgent telegrams to St. Petersburg, Nicholas deliberately ignored them, making them wait months for a reply. It was a masterclass in imperial arrogance. But there was another, far darker reason why Nicholas was so eager to provoke a confrontation. By the winter of 1903, the Russian Empire was beginning to rot from the inside. The illusion of absolute power was cracking. Across the vast Russian landscape, millions of peasants were starving. In the grimy, overcrowded factories of St. Petersburg and Moscow, industrial workers were going on strike. Radical Marxist ideologies were spreading like a virus, and revolutionary terrorists were throwing bombs at government carriages, assassinating ministers and governors in daylight. The Tsar was rapidly losing the love of his people, and he was terrified of losing his throne. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of domestic crisis that the Minister of the Interior, Vyacheslav von Plehve, uttered one of the most famously disastrous sentences in political history. Speaking to the Minister of War, Plehve stated, "What this country needs to avert a revolution is a small, victorious war." It was a cynical, deadly miscalculation. Nicholas II believed that a swift, glorious military triumph over an allegedly weak Asian enemy
would trigger a massive wave of patriotism. He believed a war would unite the fractured Russian people around their Tsar, make them forget their empty stomachs, and drown out the voices of the revolutionaries. He did not prepare the army for a serious conflict. He did not fortify the supply lines along the unfinished Trans-Siberian Railway. He simply sat in his palace, convinced that his sheer divine authority would bend the Japanese to his will. But the Japanese had run out of patience, and they had no intention of fighting the kind of war the Tsar was expecting. As the icy winds of February 1904 swept across the Pacific, the trap was finally set. The macaques that Nicholas so deeply despised were about to unleash a storm of steel and fire that would shake the Russian Empire to its very foundations.
On the evening of February 8, 1904, the Russian Pacific Squadron was anchored in the outer roadstead of Port Arthur. The mighty battleships, painted in peacetime white and yellow, were fully illuminated. Ashore, the Russian Naval Command was hosting a lavish banquet to celebrate the name day of the fleet commander's wife. Champagne flowed, music drifted across the water, and the officers toasted to the glory of the Tsar. Nobody was looking at the dark horizon. Nobody actually believed the Japanese would dare to attack without a formal, gentlemanly declaration of war. It was a fatal, aristocratic delusion. Just before midnight, the shadows on the water began to move. 10 Japanese destroyers slipped past the Russian patrols under the cover of darkness. At exactly 11:33 p.m., they unleashed a swarm of torpedoes. Explosions ripped through the freezing night. 3 of Russia's most powerful warships, the battleships Tsesarevich and Retvizan and the cruiser Pallada, were heavily damaged, their hulls torn open by the blasts. Panic erupted in the harbor. Searchlights wildly swept the sky, and Russian gunners fired blindly into the empty darkness. The Japanese destroyers had already vanished. More than 30 decades before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military had perfected the art of the devastating, undeclared preemptive strike. When the telegram detailing the attack reached the Winter Palace, Tsar Nicholas II was genuinely stunned. He wrote in his diary that he was appalled by the treachery of the Japanese. His arrogance was so absolute that he felt personally insulted by the fact that the enemy did not fight according to his rules. But the shock quickly morphed into a terrifying realization. The Tsar was now trapped in a war he was completely unprepared to fight. On paper, the Russian Empire boasted a standing army of over 1 million men, the largest in the world. Japan's army was less than a third of that size. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought on geography. The epicenter of the conflict was Manchuria, thousands of miles away from the industrial heart of European Russia. To get soldiers, bullets, and bandages to the front line, the Tsar had to rely entirely on a single fragile steel artery, the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was the longest supply line in the history of human warfare. But in 1904, the railway wasn't even finished. There was a massive 100-mile gap right in the middle at Lake Baikal. In the dead of the Siberian winter, Russian troops were forced to disembark from their warm train cars and march on foot across the frozen, howling expanse of the lake. They dragged their artillery pieces over the ice using horses, praying the ice wouldn't crack. It was a logistical nightmare that strangled the Russian war effort from the very first day. While the Russian reinforcements trickled eastward at an agonizingly slow pace, the highly organized Japanese military was pouring troops onto the Asian mainland.
The Japanese land campaign was swift and brutal. They pushed the Russian forces back from the Yalu River, winning engagement after engagement. The Russian soldiers fought with legendary stubborn bravery, but they were being led by donkeys. The Russian high command was dominated by aging, corrupt aristocrats who owed their positions to court favoritism, not tactical genius. They were fighting a 19th century war with Napoleonic mentalities, marching their men in tight formations straight into the teeth of modern rapid-fire Japanese artillery and Maxim machine guns. But the ultimate prize and the ultimate meat grinder of the war was the fortress city of Port Arthur. The Third Army, commanded by General Nogi Maresuke, laid siege to the city. Nogi was an old-school samurai who viewed warfare as a matter of absolute spiritual devotion. He threw wave after wave of his own soldiers into the Russian defenses. The fighting around Port Arthur foreshadowed the trench horrors of World War I. Men drowned in mud and blood. Barbed wire was used defensively for one of the first times in history. Searchlights illuminated night attacks, and hand grenades tore through the claustrophobic trenches.
The focal point of the carnage was a heavily fortified Russian position known as 203-meter Hill. Whoever controlled the hill could fire down directly into the harbor, where the remnants of the Russian fleet were hiding. General Nogi ordered his men to take the hill at any cost. For months, the hill was a slaughterhouse. Nogi lost tens of thousands of men, including his own 2 sons, but he did not stop. By December 1904, marching over the decaying corpses of their comrades, the Japanese finally captured the bloody summit. They immediately dragged massive 11-inch siege howitzers to the top and began raining armor-piercing shells down onto the trapped Russian warships. One by one, the pride of the Tsar's Pacific Fleet was systematically blown to pieces and sunk in the shallow, muddy water of the harbor. On January 2, 1905, the Russian commander of Port Arthur, having run out of ammunition and hope, formally surrendered the fortress to the Japanese. The news hit St. Petersburg like a physical blow. The invincible Russian Empire had lost its premier naval base in the east. For Tsar Nicholas, the surrender was not just a military defeat, it was a deeply personal, divine humiliation. His ego could not process the fact that the people he had dismissed as macaques were comprehensively dismantling his empire. He could have sued for peace. He could have accepted the loss and focused on the massive political unrest that was boiling over in his own streets. But a man blinded by arrogance rarely knows when to stop. Driven to the point of absolute desperation, Nicholas II decided he needed a miracle. He would roll the dice one last time. If his Pacific Fleet was at the bottom of the ocean, he would simply send another fleet. He would send the entire Baltic Fleet on an impossible suicidal voyage to the other side of the planet to exact his revenge. And thus began the Voyage of the Damned. In October 1904, the Tsar's ultimate gamble began. The 2nd Pacific Squadron, formed primarily from the Russian Baltic Fleet, steamed out of the port of Libau into the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. Their mission was unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. They were ordered to sail 18,000 miles, more than halfway around the globe, engage a highly trained enemy fleet, relieve the siege of Port Arthur, and win the war. It was an order born of absolute imperial delusion. To understand the sheer madness of this voyage, you have to look at the fleet itself. It was a bizarre, mismatched armada. The core consisted of 4 brand-new, heavily armed battleships, but they were rushed through production, top-heavy, and prone to mechanical failures. The rest of the fleet was a floating museum of obsolete, outdated cruisers and coastal defense ships that the sailors bitterly referred to as self-sinking irons. Worse than the ships with a cruise. Because the best sailors were already trapped or dead in the Pacific, this new fleet was manned by inexperienced conscripts. Many were peasant boys from the deep Russian interior who had never even seen the ocean, let alone operated the complex steam machinery of a modern warship. Commanding this floating circus was Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. He was a strict, short-tempered disciplinarian who was known to throw his binoculars overboard in fits of rage. But Rozhestvensky was no fool. Unlike the Tsar safely tucked away in his palace, the admiral knew exactly what this mission was. Before leaving, he privately confessed to his friends that the fleet was doomed and that he was sailing to his death. But as a loyal servant of the emperor, he followed his orders. The paranoia set in almost immediately. Rumors ran wild through the uneducated crews that the waters of Europe were swarming with phantom Japanese torpedo boats, supposedly operating out of secret bases. This mass hysteria culminated in one of the most embarrassing and dangerous diplomatic blunders in naval history, the Doggerbank incident. On October 21st, as the Russian Armada entered the North Sea off the coast of England, a heavy fog rolled in. Suddenly, the Russian lookouts spotted silhouettes in the mist. Panic erupted. Bugles sounded to quarters. The inexperienced gunners, terrified of a Japanese ambush, opened fire with everything they had. The heavy guns roared, sending armor-piercing shells tearing through the darkness. In the chaos, Russian ships even began firing on each other, damaging their own cruisers.
But there were no Japanese warships in the North Sea. The Russian Armada had just unleashed a massive artillery barrage on a fleet of unarmed British fishing trawlers from the port of Hull. One British fishing boat was sunk, several were damaged, and 2 innocent fishermen were killed. The Russian fleet, realizing their mistake, didn't even stop to rescue the survivors. They just kept sailing. When the news reached London, the British public and government were absolutely furious. The Royal Navy's home fleet was immediately mobilized, and 28 British battleships prepared for war. Great Britain, the most powerful naval force on Earth, was within inches of declaring war on the Russian Empire. The Tsar was forced to issue a humiliating public apology and pay massive financial compensation just to stop the British from blowing his fleet out of the water. Even so, British cruisers shadowed the Russian Armada all the way down the coast of Europe, watching them like hawks. But diplomatic humiliation was only the beginning. The real enemy was logistics. These massive steel leviathans were entirely dependent on coal. To make an 18,000-mile journey, the fleet needed thousands of tons of it. But because of diplomatic pressure from Japan's ally Great Britain, almost no neutral ports would allow the Russian fleet to dock and refuel. Rozhestvensky was forced to load coal at sea or in remote, unprotected anchorages using contracted German supply ships. The physical toll on the crews was unimaginable. In the sweltering tropical heat, sailors worked around the clock, carrying heavy sacks of coal on their backs. The ships were overloaded beyond capacity. Coal was stored in the mess halls, in the officers' cabins, and even in the bathrooms. Black, choking coal dust covered everything. It was in the food they ate, the water they drank, and the air they breathed. Respiratory diseases swept through the fleet. Denied access to the Suez Canal, the Armada was forced to take the longest possible route, all the way down the western coast of Africa, around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope,
and into the Indian Ocean. By December, the fleet reached the French colony of Madagascar off the coast of Africa, and here they received an order from the Tsar that broke whatever remained of their morale. They were ordered to stop and wait for reinforcements, a squadron of even older, slower, obsolete ships that the Tsar had scraped together from the bottom of the barrel. They sat at anchor in the scorching tropical heat of Madagascar for 2.5 agonizing months. This waiting period turned the fleet into a floating asylum.
The heat inside the steel hulls regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid broke out. Men went mad from the heat and the psychological pressure. Suicides and mutinies became common, ruthlessly suppressed by Admiral Rozhestensky. And then the sailors began bringing the jungle on board. To combat the crushing boredom, the crews started buying exotic animals from the local markets. The warships were transformed into bizarre, diseased zoos. Monkeys swung from the rigging and stole the captain's navigation charts. Chameleons crawled over the artillery guns. Parrots squawked in the mess halls. Sailors even brought deadly venomous snakes and massive crocodiles on board. In one famous incident, a pet crocodile escaped and caused mass panic on the deck of a cruiser, while a monkey bit a senior officer, leading to a severe infection. It was the theater of the absurd. The pride of the Russian Empire was slowly rotting in the tropics, surrounded by coal dust, disease, and exotic animals. While they suffered in Madagascar, the final crushing blow was delivered via telegram. Port Arthur, the very fortress they were sailing to save, had surrendered to the Japanese, and the Russian Pacific squadron they were supposed to reinforce had been completely destroyed. The primary objective of their mission no longer existed. Logically, strategically, the only sane decision was to turn the fleet around and go home. Admiral Rozhestensky begged St. Petersburg to recall them. But Tsar Nicholas II, sitting comfortably in his palace thousands of miles away from the heat and the sickness, refused. Driven by a desperate need to save face, the emperor ordered the fleet to continue forward to the port of Vladivostok. They were to punch through the Japanese-controlled waters, no matter the cost. In March 1905, the Armada pulled up its anchors. The men knew they were sailing into a trap. Ahead of them lay the cold, dark waters of the Tsushima Strait and an enemy that had been waiting for them for 7 long months.
Late May 1905, after 7 grueling months at sea, after sailing 18,000 miles through storms, sickness, and paralyzing heat, the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron finally approached the Sea of Japan. The men were utterly exhausted. Their ships were rusted, their engines were failing, and the hulls were so heavily weighed down by extra coal that their main armor belts were submerged beneath the waterline. They were essentially unarmored targets. Admiral Rozhestensky knew the Japanese fleet was waiting for him. He chose the shortest but most dangerous route to Vladivostok, straight through the narrow Tsushima Strait, right between Korea and Japan. He hoped the heavy fog of the season would cloak his armada and allow them to slip through unnoticed. But luck had completely abandoned the Russian Empire. On the early morning of May 27th, the fog momentarily parted. A Japanese scout cruiser spotted the glowing lights of a Russian hospital ship. The alarm was sounded. Radio telegraphs, a relatively new technology that the Japanese utilized with lethal efficiency, began buzzing across the strait. Waiting for them was Admiral Togo Heihachiro, one of the most brilliant naval tacticians of the modern age. Togo had spent the last 7 months resting his crews, repairing his ships, and drilling his gunners relentlessly. His fleet was painted in a modern, stealthy battle gray, perfectly blending in with the misty ocean. The Russian ships, by contrast, were still painted with their tall black funnels and bright yellow trim, massive, highly visible bullseyes on the gray water. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the two massive armadas finally saw each other. Admiral Togo executed a maneuver that is still studied in naval academies today. It was a breathtakingly daring move known as crossing the T. Instead of sailing parallel to the Russian column, Togo ordered his entire fleet to make a sharp U-turn directly in front of the advancing Russian ships. For a terrifying 15 minutes, while the Japanese ships were turning, they were highly vulnerable. The Russian gunners opened fire. Massive 12-inch shells screamed through the air and slammed into the Japanese cruisers. But then the fatal technological gap between the two empires revealed itself.
The Russian ammunition was defective. Decades of corruption in the imperial defense industry meant that many of the Russian shells were filled with cheap powder, and the fuses had been compromised by the high humidity of the tropical voyage. Dozens of heavy Russian shells hit the Japanese ships, but they simply shattered on impact or failed to detonate. Then the Japanese completed their turn. They formed a horizontal line across the top of the Russian vertical column, bringing every single one of their broadside guns to bear on the leading Russian battleships. Admiral Togo gave the order to return fire, and hell opened its gates. The Japanese did not use standard armor-piercing rounds. They used a newly developed, highly unstable explosive known as shimose powder. These shells were designed to explode immediately upon contact with any surface, even a wooden deck or a wire rigging. When the Japanese shells hit the Russian battleships, they didn't just punch holes in the armor, they detonated with the force of a localized volcanic eruption. The shimose powder burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It instantly melted steel bulkheads. It vaporized human bodies. The toxic, suffocating black smoke from the explosions poured into the ventilation systems, asphyxiating the Russian engineers trapped deep in the engine rooms. The Russian flagship, the Knyaz Suvorov, became the primary target. Within minutes, it was completely engulfed in a raging firestorm. The heat was so intense that the paint on the hull was boiling and the deck plates were glowing red. A Japanese shell struck the bridge, blasting Admiral Rozhestvensky into the air. A piece of shrapnel embedded itself deep into his skull, leaving the entire Russian fleet without a commander. The rigid, aristocratic Russian command structure immediately collapsed. Without the admiral to give orders, the Russian captains did not know what to do. They blindly followed the burning, sinking flagship in a chaotic, disorganized circle, while the Japanese fleet systematically picked them off, one by one, firing with surgical precision. It was not a battle. It was an execution. By sunset, the pride of the Tsar's navy was completely shattered. 4 of Russia's newest battleships had been blown to pieces and slipped beneath the waves, taking thousands of trapped, screaming sailors to the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. But the horror was not over. As darkness fell, Admiral Togo pulled his heavy battleships back and unleashed his destroyers and torpedo boats. For the surviving Russian sailors, the night of May 27th was an absolute nightmare. In the pitch-black ocean, swarms of Japanese torpedo boats attacked the crippled, burning Russian ships from all sides. Searchlights swept frantically across the water. The sea was filled with the deafening roar of torpedo impacts, the groaning of twisting metal, and the cries of drowning men. When the sun finally rose on the morning of May 28th, the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron simply ceased to exist.
Rear Admiral Nebogatov, who had taken command of the few remaining heavily damaged ships, looked at the Japanese armada surrounding him. He realized that firing another shot would be nothing but a meaningless suicide for his surviving men. Defying the strict, archaic honor code of the Russian Imperial Navy, Nebogatov ordered the white flag of surrender to be raised. The statistics of the massacre were incomprehensible. Out of the 38 Russian ships that had sailed 18,000 miles, 21 were sunk. 7 were captured by the Japanese. 6 were disarmed in neutral ports. Only 3 small, battered vessels managed to escape the slaughter and reach the port of Vladivostok. Over 5,000 Russian sailors were dead. 6,000 were taken prisoner. On the Japanese side, Admiral Togo lost exactly 3 small torpedo boats and only 117 men. In a single afternoon, the Russian Empire lost its entire status as a global naval superpower. The Tsar's arrogant gamble had failed in the most absolute catastrophic manner imaginable. And as the shocking news raced across the telegraph wires towards St. Petersburg, it carried with it the spark that would finally set the Russian homeland on fire.
When the telegraphs containing the full, horrific details of the Tsushima massacre finally reached the imperial residence outside St. Petersburg, the reaction of Tsar Nicholas II was perhaps the most chilling detail of the entire war. According to memoirs of the court, when the Tsar was handed the dispatch confirming that his entire Baltic Fleet lay at the bottom of the ocean and thousands of his sailors were dead, he was preparing to play tennis. He read the telegram, folded it, placed it in his pocket, and calmly walked out to the tennis court to begin his match. To the isolated autocrat, the annihilation of his navy was an unfortunate inconvenience, but to the Russian people, it was the apocalypse. The loss of the Russo-Japanese War was not just a military defeat, it was a catastrophic spiritual collapse. For centuries, the absolute authority of the Tsar was built on a single unshakable pillar, the divine right of kings. The Tsar was the protector of the Orthodox faith, chosen by God to rule. But the illiterate peasants and the furious factory workers were now asking a dangerous question. If God is with the Tsar, how did a nation of non-Christians, a people the Tsar had arrogantly dismissed as macaques, completely destroy his invincible army and sink his holy fleet? The myth of the Tsar's divine protection was dead. The magic was gone. The small victorious war that was supposed to prevent a revolution instead became its greatest catalyst. The domestic situation had already begun to spiral out of control earlier that year. In January 1905, just weeks after the humiliating surrender of Port Arthur, a massive crowd of starving, desperate workers marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They were not carrying weapons, they were carrying icons of the saints and portraits of Tsar Nicholas, singing hymns and begging their little father for bread and better working conditions. But the Tsar was not there, and his soldiers, nervous and poorly commanded, opened fire on the unarmed crowd. The snow outside the palace turned red. Hundreds of men, women, and children were slaughtered in what became known as Bloody Sunday. The bullets fired on Bloody Sunday, combined with the humiliating naval disaster at Tsushima a few months later, ignited the Russian Empire. The revolution of 1905 exploded across the country. Battleships in the Black Sea mutinied. Entire cities were paralyzed by general strikes. The peasantry burned the estates of the aristocrats.
Nicholas II was forced to the negotiating table. In September 1905, in a treaty brokered by United States President Theodore Roosevelt, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts,
Russia officially admitted defeat. The Tsar ceded strategic territories, evacuated Manchuria, and recognized Japan's dominance in Korea. But the territorial losses were meaningless compared to the psychological damage. In a desperate bid to save his throne from the raging revolution, Nicholas was forced to sign the October Manifesto, officially ending centuries of absolute autocracy and granting the Russian people a parliament. He survived the uprising, but the supreme, unquestioned power of the Romanovs was permanently broken. Nicholas never learned his lesson. He remained stubbornly convinced of his divine right, and he spent the next decade trying to claw back the power he had surrendered, completely blind to the fact that his empire was a powder keg waiting for a match. 12 years later, he would drag his exhausted, fractured country into the meat grinder of the First World War, an act that would finally bring the Romanov dynasty crashing down into the blood-soaked cellar of the Apachev house. But the road to that dark basement did not begin in 1917. It began in the sunlit streets of Japan with the swing of a samurai sword. It began with a blood-stained shirt, a deeply racist grudge, and a man whose ego was so massive that he sent a fleet of 38 ships and thousands of men on an 18,000-mile suicide mission simply because he refused to believe that an Asian nation could defeat him. Admiral Alexander Kolchak, the tragic figure we explored in our previous episode, tried to save the remnants of this shattered empire during the Civil War, but the rot had started long before Kolchak took command. It started here in the freezing trenches of Port Arthur and the fiery hell of Tsushima. What do you think? Was the fall of the Russian Empire inevitable, or could Nicholas II have saved his dynasty if he had simply swallowed his pride and avoided the war with Japan? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the dark and tragic history of the Russian Empire, please hit the like button and subscribe to Tsars and Soviets. We are just getting started, and the next chapter is going to be even darker. I am Mark. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.